Bold were your days as the mountains, high soaring. Bold were your plains and canyons cut through. Daring were your coulees and blizzard winds roaring. And bender the people you fostered in you. Chapter 2. Killing of Joe P. Beckham. In December, I was moved to a line camp near Doan's Crossing on Red River. The cowboys all sought shelter in dugouts or wagons as the weather was dreary and bitter cold. The ground was frozen hard. The scent of rain on the blizzard winds lingered for days before heavy snow started. Cattle huddled too cold to move about. It was because of this extremely hazardous weather that I met Joe P. Beckham, the sheriff who turned outlaw. The meeting took place in a sod house built on the slope and the side of a hill. When Hill Loftus, who had now joined up with the notorious Red Buck Whiteman, worked for Dan Wagoner, he used the dugout for his home. To better understand Joe Beckham and why he hit the Owl Hoot Trail, it is only fair to tell his story in chronological order since he had been branded by historians as a sheriff who turned outlaw. Joe Beckham was the youngest son of Roderick Carroll Beckham Sr. and Sally Bundy of Olive Hill, Tennessee. When Sally died around 1870, Mr. Beckham wagoned up the 7 children and headed for Texas, where he settled in Grayson County. There he married a woman with several children. In 1880, his 5th son was born. Shortly thereafter, he deserted his family for several years. By the time Mr. Beckham left, his oldest son, Roderick Carroll Jr., was on his own. A daughter named Nancy had married well-to-do man named McCarty from Ennis, Texas, so brothers Joe, Jim, and John lived with her for a spell. I will mention here that after Roderick Carroll Jr. came to Texas and he got on his own, he never used any other name but Buck, and that's the only name I ever heard him use. I didn't meet Buck until after Joe's death. The stories of Bruce and Joe are tragic ones in the Beckham family. Buck went to work for Henry H. Campbell of the famous Matador Ranch, and then Jim and Joe joined him in 1882. Joe was 17 years old, Jeff Boone, who was running a wagon on the Matador, and Joe began to have trouble. Boone constantly harassed Joe about one thing or another. Once he told him no son of a nester could make a good cowhand. Most of the Matador hands commented that they thought Joe should have killed Boone sooner than he did. Joe was good-natured and tried not to cause any trouble, as he needed the work. No one seemed quite sure why Boone hated Joe so much. Most of the cowboys felt at one time or another the brunt of his sarcasm, but he particularly picked on Joe. He was called the ranch bully. Once he made the statement, either Joe Beckham will kill me or Jeff Harkey one of these days, because them's the only 2 men I know ain't afraid of me. Several times Boone hit Joe on top of the head with a heavy rope. An old cowboy named Bain witnessed the act, and many years later repeated what he had seen to Lula Beckham, Kate, Jim's daughter. He hit Joe on the head as he rode by him on the horse, circling round where Joe was standing. Joe's slow reaction to the undeserved abuse he took from Jeff Boone was in no way a reflection on his character. Joe was killed by Matador crew, but Boone was determined to have a showdown. By this time, Joe had married a girl named Christio Ray, and his brother Jim named a girl named Katie Franklin. Once when Katie Beckham was visiting what was known as the Mott Line Camp on the ranch, she witnessed some of Boone's meanness. She had gone to the camp to talk with Joe. As she stood watching him sharpen a knife on an old grindstone, several men rode up with Boone in the lead. The other cowboys who had been standing around Joe suddenly had business elsewhere. Katie begged her handsome brother-in-law to leave, but he refused and continued with his business at hand. Finally, Boone rode on. When Motley County was organized in 1891, half the Matador hands went into town to run for office. The county was not settled, so Matador men filled all the vacant offices. Joe was appointed its first sheriff, but Motley County seemed destined to have a political upheaval for some 3 years. Jeff highly resented the fact that Joe had been chosen for the sheriff, and Boone came into the courthouse and had an argument ensued over a horse Joe was riding. Boone cursed at Joe, then reached for his gun. Joe quickly let go with shots and hit his assailant in the arm. Joe was hit but not badly wounded. At the time of the shooting, Harry H. Campbell, a lad of 5, did some quick thinking. He saw Joe, whom he loved dearly, bleeding profusely and wanted to help him. He rushed home and got his meager savings and bought Joe a new shirt. Boone was not seriously hurt, but he was too stubborn to see a doctor. The wound became infected and his arm started to rot. He was finally persuaded to go to Fort Worth to a hospital to have it treated. He died en route to blood poisoning. Joe was brought to trial for Boone's murder. The case was moved to Florida, Texas, on change of venue. Beckham was acquitted. When the jury brought in the verdict of not guilty, the district judge pounded on his desk and shouted, "If this is justice, the whole world is going to hell!" Joe became the victim of a political storm which began to brew over the county. He had arrested some matador cowhands, and for this he was made quick enemies for himself. The town of Matador was beginning to build, and many settlers complained over Matador land and cattle company control over the town. It looked as though there would be a small war declared in settlers against ranchers. Some feared that the Matador cowhands would arm themselves and clean out the town, causing useless bloodshed. The land boom came off in Oklahoma, and Joe went to file. When he returned to his office, he found the commissioner's court had held a special meeting and put J.L. Moore in as sheriff. They put Joe under arrest on a trumped-up charge of fraud and tried to take his guns. They claimed he had appointed deputies without regard to the budget of his office. District Judge Billy McGill ruled that the court had no authority to appoint a new sheriff. He refused to recognize Moore, he refused to put Beckham back in office, and named Billy Moses to be the sheriff. Mrs. Henry H. Campbell was postmistress Matador, and Harry was standing in the post office door and saw Joe when he and 2 of the deputies arrested Moore and his deputies and herded them towards the jail. He heard Joe say, "No damn bunch of men are going to wear guns if I can't." Someone wired to the governor for ranger help. Friends with influence persuaded Joe to leave until things cooled down. Shortly after Joe left, John Pierce Matthews, who was sheriff of Childress County, deputized a bunch of nesters and headed for the Matador Ranch to arrest Joe on a misdemeanor charge. They came up the draw that ran through the ranch, and some of them came down the creek, others gathered at the ranch. When they closed in, they found that Joe's deputies were having their breakfast. They arrested them, but Matthews wasn't satisfied. He reasoned that Beckham was hiding in the territory and decided to go after him. John Pierce Matthews, who had become simply John Pierce after killing a man in Louisiana, and still another in the Panhandle before becoming sheriff, had also made open threats on the life of Ranger Captain Bill McDonald. There were 2 reasons why Pierce hated Ranger McDonald. One, he had tried to join a secret organization of which McDonald was a member. He failed to get in, and he knew why. Second, while on a boat excursion between Houston and Galveston, Matthews spoke disrespectfully to Governor Hogg. McDonald demanded an immediate apology. If well-meaning friends on both sides had not intervened, they would have sooner ended their differences. McDonald tried for a time to ignore the insults and humors that Matthews slung at him. Matthews had no business in the Beckham affair, but he picked up Cook, who had now been elected to the job of Motley County Sheriff, and who had vowed he would kill Beckham on sight, and together they headed for Quanah, where McDonald was staying at the time. Matthews demanded that McDonald furnish them with rangers to go into the nations after Joe. McDonald sent only 1 man, and warned him not to go over the border as rangers had no jurisdiction there. Nothing but trouble could follow such actions from a ranger. Ranger McClure helped the 2 men capture Joe, but they lost him through a writ of habeas corpus, and according to McDonald's version of the story, Cook and Matthews then plotted to kill Ranger McClure. McDonald drove 100 miles in bad weather to get McClure out of trouble for crossing over the border. He returned with a sadder but wiser lawman. Joe Beckham went into Quanah and gave himself up to Ranger McClure, who had promised him immunity. McClure set out a rail with the prisoner, and Joe had told him Cook and Matthews would kill him in Childress if they saw him, or knew he would be passing through. True to character, Matthews and Cook tried to take McClure's prisoner. Matthews organized a posse to take Beckham by force. McClure handed Joe a gun and told him to defend himself. The sheriff of Abilene, Texas, Cunningham, was with Matthews when he learned the truth and switched sides. When the lawman and the prisoner arrived at Matador, Captain McDonald greeted them, and Joe was promptly put into jail with no further problem. In McDonald's accounts, he claimed Matthews demanded for Ranger McClure to be dismissed from the force for his part in the Beckham affair. It was generally assumed Matthews and Cook had planned to shoot Beckham on sight, and McClure had intervened. When McDonald refused, Matthews began making open threats on the Ranger's life. Cook had made his open threats on the life of Joe Beckham. In November of 1894, while Joe was out on bond, G.W. Cook tried to make good his threats. While Joe and his brother John were walking down the street of Seymour, Texas, a bullet whizzed between John's legs. The two men turned just in time to see Cook dodge behind a building and disappear from sight. In the later part of May 1895, Joe's trial for stealing was to be held at Seymour. The Cook came to town to testify against Joe. Cook had the county records in a seamless sack. Dr. Mooney and an attorney were with Cook when they arrived. They came by rail, and just as Cook hit the platform, Joe said, "Hello, Cook. I told you not to show up." Joe beat Cook to the draw, killing him on the spot. Then Joe mounted a horse someone had been holding for him and rode out of town north to the Wichita River breaks. I did not see the killing, but I got there right after. I saw 3 men carry the blood-spattered body of G.W. Cook. I heard bystanders talking about how Joe had twirled his gun around his finger 2 times before he fired, and it was generally assumed that he would head for the Indian Territory. While Joe was on the run, Matthews came back into Quanah and sent word around town that he was there to kill Captain McDonald. He and his cronies visited several saloons, gathering courage. He sent Old Man Crutchard to tell Captain that he was ready to meet him on the street. When Matthews appeared, he was walking with the sheriff of Hardin County, Dick Coffer. It turned out to be 4 against 1. When they came together on Main Street, McDonald accused Matthews of making nasty threats on his life. Matthews denied such remarks, but he pointed his left index finger at McDonald's face and edged closer to Sheriff Coffer, as his right hand headed for his hip pocket. Seeing the move, the captain reached inside his overcoat pocket for his own gun. He let out 2 shots which jumped close to Matthews' heart, but a plug of Star Navy in the heavy notebook behind that stopped the 2 bullets. When Matthews fired, his bullet hit McDonald in the left shoulder. He staggered, but did not fall. In fact, during the entire fracas, Captain McDonald never hit the ground. Matthews quickly fired again. The Ranger was close enough to Matthews to knock aside the gun. The bullet passed through his hat brim. When McDonald delivered his 3rd shot, Matthews fell to the cold ground. Other men with him began to fire on McDonald. 2 more bullets sailed into his left arm. Then a ball hit him in the right shoulder. That bullet traveled through his neck, on his windpipe, and lodged in his left side, paralyzing his fingers. This noble lawman then made a feeble attempt to cock his gun with his teeth, but it was over. His assailants began to scatter, leaving the 2 wounded men alone on the streets of Quanah. Captain McDonald never completely recovered. Matthews died, but not before he sent his apologies to McDonald, telling him that he had acted like a real man all the way. Just more useless bloodshed to shape and mold the West. By now, District Judge Budge Billy McGill had appointed B.F. Harper to fill the unexpired term of G.W. Cook. The county had been put under martial law, and about that time, unable to go himself, McDonald sent Sergeant W.J.L. Sullivan and his rangers into Matador, putting the town under martial law for about 10 days. Joe P. Beckham had now joined up with the natural-born killers. They were all old offenders with no regard for human life. I met them all at one time or another as they came to the line camp for food or sleep. As mentioned before, I knew Hill Loftus and his family for many years. One night, Jim Beckham came to the dugout and tried to talk with Joe. He got word where Joe was, told his wife, Katie, and he was going to visit with Joe, and went on train to the nearest town. He then got a horse from the livery stable and rode out to what he thought was the vicinity of the dugout. But night was overtaking him, so he rode up to a house, and at his hello, a woman came to the door. She asked him what he wanted. Jim asked her if some men were camping around there. Folks in those days didn't talk about what they knew, so she quickly replied she knew of no one nearby. He asked her if he might spend the night there since it was so late. The woman told him to put his horse in the barn and sit on the porch as her husband would be there soon. She was very busy with supper. Jim hadn't been on the porch long when a young boy came riding up on a horse, bareback. He had an empty bucket in his hand. He eyed Jim and then passed into the kitchen. He soon returned with a bucket of milk and stopped in front of Beckham and asked him if he was Joe's brother. "Yes, I'm Jim Beckham." "Well, come with me if you want to see him." This young man was Hill Loftus. Jim lost no time getting his horse saddled and following Hill through the woods. When they were within a quarter of a mile of the dugout, known as Sutter's Line Camp, the kid stopped, hooted like an owl, and waited until he was answered in the same way. Then he turned to Jim and asked, "Do you have a gun?" "Yes, I have one," Jim replied. "I'll have to have it before we ride in." Jim handed over his gun and rode into the thicket with Hill Loftus, who was later to change his name to escape the law. Joe Beckham was already involved with Hill. Kid Lewis, Red Buck, George Waitman, and others not present the night he was killed. These outlaws started their raids around Electra, Texas, not far from where my folks were living at the time. Taylor Holt, who was a bookkeeper at the Dan Wagner store, sent word to the Rangers that 4 men had robbed him, and one clerk had been beaten nearly to death. Sullivan and Jack Harnell left Vernon for Wagner, for they knew by the description they were on Joe's trail. Alf Bailey, whom I knew well, had also been robbed to join the Rangers in the hunt. My mother ran to Osborne Post Office and Alf on the Rondy. The desperados had taken some $700 and all the stamps he had on hand. Ranger Sullivan notified all the officers up and down the line, giving a description of Joe. A large posse of lawmen started out in search, including Sheriff Moses and Constable Tom Pickett from Wichita Falls. But Hardin, who was a ranger from Harold, Dick Sanders, sheriff of Wilburger County, and deputy sheriff from the same county. Also in the bunch was Ranger Charlie Landers, who was the city marshal of Vernon. Other rangers were Bob McClure, Billy McCauley, Lee Queen, and maybe others I don't remember. On the eve of December 28th, the blue norther hit hard. It was so cold that night the coyotes' howls froze in the air. I was in the dugout making myself some biscuits and trying to keep from freezing to death. I heard the snorting of horses in the stillness. I stepped to the door, and Red Buck shoved me aside as he pretended to play. Hill and Kid Lewis jumped and cavorted around, drinking and singing. The outlaws had about 13 stolen horses penned in the Sutter's cow pens. I hardly had time to realize what was taking place. I took refuge behind a stack of wood at first. When the heavy firing really started, a bullet struck my pan of biscuits, shattering them all over the place. Red Buck Whiteman never stopped his steady stream of cursing and complaining. All I've ever read about that outlaw is my knowledge true, for he was a cold-blooded killer and hated mankind. The officers had seen the light of the dugout window, and not realizing their danger, they started for the door. It was bad out for man or beast, and they needed food and rest. The first shots that were fired from the dugout at the lawman killed 3 of the horses. 6 of Sullivan's men had fallen behind, so they decided to wait a spell for them. 5 were still with them, so when the firing began, the lawman gathered speed and rode towards the old sod house on the side of a hill. Sergeant Sullivan made 3 attempts to get his Winchester out of the scabbard, but his horse just kept rearing with him, and he fell from his horse, but with his gun in hand, suffering a broken rib. As he hit the frozen ground, he opened fire on Red Buck, who was brazenly standing in the open door, swearing at the officers. The bullet hit his breastplate, knocking him off balance. He wasn't hurt. Later, he was wounded. I crouched in the far corner, for I knew by the stolen goods the 4 men had brought in with them that they had hit the border towns again. I remember Joe Beckham said very little, but Red Buck was always cursing and swearing about something. Kid Lewis is now more of a blur in my memory, but I will take the memory of Hill Loftus to my grave. When Hill was about 13, he came to Dan Wagner for work. He hailed from some northern part of Mississippi, and had a brother named Jerome who was living in the area, who Hill lived with until he joined the Red Buck gang. Hill was restless and had an itch for excitement. He tried to get me to steal with him on several occasions. He met Tim Buck in one of the line camps and took off with him before Jerome knew what plans he had made. Hill couldn't have joined up with a meaner, viler man than George Wayman. In 1889, Marshal Heck Thomas of the Territory arrested him for horse stealing. He was sent to prison where he stayed until October of 1892. Within a week after he had been set free, he stole 7 good saddle ponies and joined the Dalton dueling gang. When the Daltons masterminded a plan to rob 2 banks in Coffeyville, Kansas, simultaneously, they plotted themselves right out of the outlaw business. Bill Doolin then took over and formed what became known as the famous or infamous dueling gang. One of the holdovers was Red Buck, a foul-mouthed, evil-minded, vicious red buck who would rather shoot a man than talk to him. It was not long after the gang robbed Rock Island train in Dover that Red Buck was kicked out of the gang. When the men camped just outside of town to count each man a share, Marshal Madsen and his posse fired on the outlaws, causing them to head for Tall Timber. Red Buck got on his horse, shot out from under him, and one named Tulsa Jack was killed trying to reach the bush. Bitter Creek Gathering was swearing Whiteman up and behind his own horse and whisked him out of the range of fire. The next day, as the gang rode along the countryside, Red Buck jumped from Bitter Creek's mount and proceeded to rope a horse from the corral. When Reverend Godfrey ran from his house, protesting that the animal belonged to his son, Red Buck shot him down in cold blood. The gang rode on for a distance, then Doolin ordered them to dismount. He gave each man his share of the loot and told Red Buck to scram. It was recorded that he told Red Buck, "You're too low-minded even for the dueling gang." Red Buck has been ostracized from his own kind, so demonic and sadistic he was. But historians relate many vile and corrupt deeds this man did before he was shot down. Disbarred from the dueling gang, Red Buck lost no time gathering up men for his own use. I can never believe Joe Beckham wanted or needed the money or articles the men stole. He seemed hurt and mad at the world. I heard his brother Buck speak of him often some time after the Ranger fight. Joe Beckham recognized Ranger Sullivan when the 4 of them ran momentarily in the dugout, opening on fire on the lawman. He crawled to the top of the house and called out that he wanted to talk to him. I heard a sickening splat as a slug as it hit Joe in the eye. He rolled from the roof and was dead when the other men pulled him back into the dugout and shut the door. It was late when the lawmen retreated. They returned on foot in the wagoner camp and waited for daylight. Those hard-hitting lawmen stuck out, walking a distance for some 20 miles, and didn't arrive at their destination until morning. We made a cot from the bed in the dugout to carry the wounded Kid Lewis on. We left Joe on the dirt floor and headed out into the icy darkness. I helped with the wounded outlaw until he died. Then I quit their company with no trouble. Hill did ride a spell with me. Then he doubled back and was shielding the old man Cobb until he left the estate. Red Buck was wounded and had to hunt a place to hide out. 2 weeks later, he was shot down outside his dugout in Roger Mills County, Oklahoma, as he came out for a bucket of water. It was reported that Red Buck began his usual cursing and made a feeble attempt to draw on the lawman. Joe Beckham was picked up by Ranger Sullivan in a buckboard and hauled to Harold, Texas, where he was buried. He was placed in his grave on Tuesday. Rumors began to fly that Joe was not really in the casket, so Adjutant General Mabee ordered an inquest to be held the following Thursday. The body was exhumed, and John Beckham was called to identify Joe. A picture was taken of the body and was sent to John. Someone drew a picture with the guns all over it and sent it to the grief-stricken family. Captain Bill McDonald wrote John Beckham and expressed his deepest sympathy for the family, but in his memoirs he did not show Joe in a very favorable light, which hurt the Beckham boys considerably. While Joe's body was out of the grave, Sullivan removed a gold wedding band from his hand, which he later gave to Mary Alice Buckham Wemderly in Altus, Oklahoma. She was grieved, but she told Sullivan she knew he had only done his duty. Joe had fallen in with bad company, and his end was inevitable. His widow, Christia Ray Beckham, soon married a man named Doane. His daughter, Lily Beckham, married a Kell from Wichita Falls, but later divorced. 2 sons are still living. Later on I met Buck Beckham and became very good friends.